Anger appeared on the girl's usually cold face as she looked at Theodore. The main character opened his eyes in fear and froze, taken by surprise. Sylvia, surrounded by a curtain of dust, looked very focused, clutching her weapon tightly in her hands. Theodore was breathing heavily. He noticed that the atmosphere around the girl had changed, wondering in confusion if he had missed something. The next second, he looked at his opponent with a look full of horror, not understanding what the hell was going on. The main character, with his head up, looked at Sylvia towering in the air, who was launching ice arrows flying at high speed, and was surprised at how much she created without a spell. Letting go of her bladed weapon, the girl glanced with contempt at the guy below, and her eyes glowed with a blue light reminiscent of two pieces of ice. Theodore looked in panic at the arrows flying at him, realizing in horror that it was impossible to dodge them. The next moment, he put his palm forward, activating the flaming palm skill, after which a protective fire shield in the shape of a palm appeared in front of the guy. Sylvia continued to gaze intently with her cold gaze at her opponent, and her snow-white hair swayed from the gusts of wind raised during the competition. Theodore stood with drops of sweat and his palm extended forward, which began to shake violently from tension. The next moment, two powerful polar elements of cold and fire collided in the air between the girl and the guy, forming a strong explosion with a distant shock wave and a flash. After this, the main character clenched his fist, but the flames continued to emanate from him in several streams, eventually turning into a large fire. Gritting his teeth from intense tension, the guy lowered his head down and began to look for something with his eyes, realizing that what he needed was still there. When I sent many orange energy streams towards Theodore, he activated Yusha's protection in front of him, which is the protective power of the west wind and uses the caster's magic to create a stream of wind that blocks the projectile. When the guy's armor was broken, scattering into transparent pieces, he began to be thrown back under the onslaught of energy directed in his direction. Stopping, Theodore looked back with an anxious look, after which he exhaled with relief, while dark smoke with red sparks was emanating from his back. A blue cold fog began to fill the battle arena, hanging in the air like a cloud. The main character, whose hair was rising up from a powerful energy flow, looked at his opponent with clenched teeth and a gloomy look, recognizing with horror the technique of the frozen earth. Sylvia stood, holding a weapon in her hands, among the cold blue abyss that covered the arena. Thanks to the freezing of the ground, the girl began to move faster, getting closer and closer to the enemy, and such magic greatly amazed the guy focused on the battle. The girl, looking piercingly with her icy blue gaze at the main character, raised her weapon above her head with a sharp movement, and he recognized it as a wooden staff, not believing his guess. The next moment, when the blow of the wooden staff went straight across the ground, Theodore flew sharply to the side from the shockwave along with pieces of the earth. The guy began to slow down with all his might, clinging to the ground with his hands and feet, which raised the sand around him, and after a complete stop he was able to exhale. Sylvia, lowering the tip of her wooden staff, watched as the guy was able to avoid damage while a curtain of sand rose around her. The blonde stood on the ground waiting, striking a fighting pose as the cold fog continued to thicken around her. Rising, Theodore sharply remembered the words of his mentor Vince that it is necessary to avoid close combat efforts with all possible forces. The menacing appearance of the student with a wooden staff in her hands and glowing red eyes, behind whom towered an eerie three-faced deity, as well as her last attack, did not allow the guy to doubt that her use of weapons was more dangerous than any magic. Sylvia was focused and was already preparing to attack the main character again, staggering in the distance, holding a wooden staff. She flew up to him in one sharp movement and began to swing her weapon with all her might, again and again breaking the ground at the enemy's feet, but not reaching him with blows since he dodged them well. As Theodore, gritting his teeth with tension, bent backwards as a wooden staff flew over his head, he concluded that he could not defeat her in close combat, so he needed to retreat at all costs. When Sylvia delivered another powerful blow, the rising flow of energy sharply threw the guy back, raising dust in the arena. The girl stayed on her feet, watching as the guy opened his mouth and shook his hands as he was carried away from her. She followed up with another furious strike, hitting her opponent directly. Theodore flew far across the arena, trying to slow down with his hand and foot, but he was unable to do so. He was thrown back by a stream of blue magical energy that Sylvia released during the strike. When Theodore stopped, he sat, drooping, on the ground with his head down, while a cold fog enveloped him. He could hardly stand up, holding his knees and lower back with clenched teeth, and concluded with displeasure that one of his crystals had been destroyed. But thanks to the recoil from the blow, he was able to move away from his opponent, which played into his hands. Theodore put his hand to his chin with a thoughtful look, reflecting on the fact that it was now necessary not to let the girl get close to him, and then cast a questioning glance. However, it was too late, as the guy realized with horror that she was standing very close to him, holding the same wooden staff in her hand. A slight, satisfied smile began to appear on the blonde's face. After that, raising her weapon, Sylvia smiled so widely that all her teeth were visible, and her face was covered with a blush, and the main character was very surprised by these things. The head of the Blue Tower and the academy teacher, standing with their hands in their pockets, intently watched the battle of their charges. Blundell smiled slightly, concluding that too much talent sometimes leads to loneliness. Vince looked at the man in bewilderment when he heard such categorical words and asked why this was happening all of a sudden. The gray-haired jock with a beard looked at his interlocutor with a satisfied look, declaring that Sylvia still could not find a real friend for herself since her views are very different from others. Rubbing his gray beard, the blue-eyed man broke into a smile, joyfully concluding that the girl was now smiling, and added that it was the first time he had seen her like this. Now Sylvia did not look formidable, quite the opposite, enthusiastically drawing Theodore's attention to herself and happily reporting that playing with each other was very cool. With his toned arms folded across his chest, the head of the blue tower watched his ward with a grin, allowing her to hang as much as she wanted, and also to find that delight that she had forgotten about a long time ago. Meanwhile, above Theodore, who was leaning on his hand, orange streams began to stretch from all sides, surrounding him. Sylvia leaned forward a little and spread her arms, focusing on controlling the icy flows behind her. Tongues of flame and ice streams began to penetrate each other, filling the arena. The girl ran away from the fiery stream at high speed, skillfully using her ice energy to accelerate. Gritting his teeth from tension, Theodore concluded that he could not let his opponent get close to him, and began to intensify the energy flow coming out of his hands. The main character made an attack using the free shot skill, and a golden energy stream was directed at the girl, but she was able to dodge it. Towering over her opponent, Sylvia raised her staff above her head with a crazy look, during which she noted that the guy had already shown her this skill. After these words, the girl furiously struck, trying to hurt Theodore. The guy flew to the side, finding himself behind the opponent's back and activating a path of illusions, which creates the effect of a mirage of the night guest in the right place thanks to the owner's shoes. Gritting his teeth, Theodore concluded that it was precisely where Sylvia was now that she had set a trap. A moment after this thought, a spear of earth was activated, which began to carry the girl away. Wrapping her body around the spear, Sylvia held a shaking wooden staff in her hand. Theodore, recalling his previous attacks, concluded that a surprise attack only works against the enemy once. The same thing does not work again. Now he looked back at the girl in horror, trying to understand whether he had harmed her this time, after which the shockwave hit the entire body of the protagonist, forcing him to bend forward. Rubbing his back, Theodore looked at what had come at him in bewilderment and realized that this girl had been poaching his skills and tactics all this time. Sylvia again took on a puppy look, spreading a satisfied smile and squinting her blue eyes. Theodore looked at his opponent with malice, concluding that she was not so simple. In the dark space, it was heard that Sylvia closed her heart. Now she was attacking the enemy using a huge amount of ice growths, while thoughts arose in her head that she had given up hope of getting closer to someone before jealousy. Hatred, misunderstanding, and detachment overtook her. In response to the girl's attack, Theodore activated an earth wave, raising streams of sand around him. All the sand was directed towards the ice growths to hold them back. Sylvia continued to think that the wall she had built around her heart had become an obstacle to reaching the fifth circle, and all attempts to overcome it remained only handprints. Raising her wooden staff, the girl felt in dismay that now her opponent had neither hatred nor fear, and besides, he continued to amaze with his magic. Now she looked softly at Theodore with her big blue eyes, feeling something strange and wanting to be closer to the guy. Sylvia closed her eyes and pressed herself against the red wall, thinking about how she wanted to conquer her opponent. While Vince was looking somewhere up from the balcony, the head of the blue tower, leaning his hand on the edge, watched his student in surprise. Blundel's blue eyes widened in amazement as he realized that the wall of the fourth circle had finally given in to Sylvia. Meanwhile, the girl with a blush on her face shouted loudly that she wanted to win, tightly gripping the staff in her hands. Theodore looked at his opponent in complete horror, afraid to imagine what she would do this time. After that, with a malicious smile, he said that he also wanted to win. After enrolling in the academy, the main character was haunted by countless failures, which the guy now recalled with bitterness. But as soon as he met Gluttony, everything changed for the better. Preparing for the attack, Theodore resolutely declared that this was the end, because he was not going to breathe down anyone's back. Sylvia, under the pressure of energy, began to rise above the ground with a staff in her hands. While the main character was watching this from the side, he realized that she was using levitation of the second circle, which makes a person float in the air, which is quite effective against ground attacks. While Sylvia concentratedly twirled the staff in her hands in front of her, ice blocks began to appear in front, protecting her. The guy looked up with a frown, warily concluding that the enemy had created an ice shield. He tried hard to remember if it was the same one that blocked his fire projectiles the first time, and the girl kept growing ice, without ceasing to twirl her staff. After this, thick pieces of ice were located throughout the arena. Theodore, still standing in place, decided that he needed to think, and concluded that he could not break through the shield with a simple attack, and besides, it was difficult to fight without seeing the exact location of the enemy. When the main character realized that Sylvia was challenging him to fight face to face, he maliciously hoped that she also had a trump card because the ice shields were simply stalling for time to prepare a complex spell. Theodore, raising his hand to his face, resolutely agreed to this adventure, wanting them to play their trump cards at the same time. After that, the guy folded his hands in front of him with a concentrated look, calling his assistant Mithra, who soared above his head. While pieces of earth were flying around, Theodore sent a prayer to the spirit of the earth, asking him to answer the call and send him stones. The main character activated the magic of fortitude of the fourth circle, which caused all the stones from the field to concentrate into 2 large piles in the air. After that, he activated the double catapult. Having finished preparing for the attack, Theodore, with a guilty look, asked for forgiveness from Murda behind his back, and she looked at him with displeasure. After this, the main character opened his hands and a fiery stream began to concentrate in the gap between the thumbs and forefingers, emanating rays to the sides. He raised his palms to the sky, thereby activating a double projectile of fire, and the flames began to rise upward. Now 2 huge boulders and 2 fiery projectiles towered in the sky in front of the main character. Baring his teeth, Theodore concluded that with all this preparation, the winner would be determined by magic. At this time, the ice protection slowly began to melt, and drops of water flowed down it. The entire ice barrier, under the pressure of fiery projectiles, flowed down with water, revealing Sylvia soaring in the sky. Then the girl closed her eyes and concentratedly began to turn to the owner of the ice cold, Ymir, conjuring to lend her his power. A powerful blue stream began to emanate from Sylvia, heading towards the enemy. Looking intently at the guy, the girl activated a light snowstorm. She then struck with her staff, releasing a blast of icy energy. The 2 opposite elements of ice and fire began to approach each other again, filling all the space around. Concentrated and serious in his intentions, Theodore, releasing a stream of fire from his hands, informed the formidable Mithra behind him that it was time to start the battle. Activated the fusion of 2 types of weapons floating in the air. After this, the fire shells enveloped the boulders. Grinning heavily, Theodore clasped his hands. The mixed stones and fire together formed a volcanic armor. After that, they rushed towards the enemy in a powerful stream, and so the main character made his attack. The blue streams were already very close to the fiery ones, and their furious collision was approaching. The volcanic armor, consisting of fire and stones, created a strong explosion that shook the space around. Even the spectators in the stands, protected by a magical barrier, felt the arena shake. The head of the Blue Tower and the academy teacher continued to stand calmly, watching the battle from the high balcony. Some spectators even began to lose their magic hats from the strong recoil after the explosion, when a whirlwind arose. Theodore quickly moved forward, and then bent his knees slightly and rested his hand on the ground, preparing for another attack. He thought that this was his limit, and now he was running out of strength. He watched the girl with a frown, realizing that if he failed to knock Sylvia down with the last attack, he would be defeated. As a result, among the dust that rose after the explosion, a female silhouette with a staff became visible. Theodore, gritting his teeth in anger, concluded with displeasure that he had failed. Blushing, Sylvia turned to the main character with a soft smile and asked what his name was. The guy widened his eyes in amazement, briefly answering that he was Theodore Miller. While the main character watched the approaching silhouette of a girl through the dust, he said that she could simply call him Theo. Theodore, who had lost all his strength, squatted down and declared that the girl could do what she wanted. Sylvia addressed the guy by his short name, deciding to offer something. Shyly lowering her head, she grabbed the staff and suggested that they take a walk together next time. Theodore was perplexed to hear such a proposal, and beads of sweat ran down his face. The artifact fell from Sylvia's hand. He was lying on the ground next to a wooden staff and a girl who had collapsed without strength. One of the spectators raised her fist, enthusiastically declaring that the winner of the student tournament had finally been determined. When it was announced that the student from the Red Tower, Vince's student, had won, he felt great pride, while Blundell, meanwhile, could not stop rejoicing that his student had finally found a friend. Theodore Miller stood in disbelief, looking wearily at the flying colored confetti as he was declared the winner of the battle. He smiled contentedly, realizing what he had heard. After which Theodore raised his fist in the air, rejoicing at such a great achievement. Theodore's clothes were draped carelessly on an antique sofa. Theodore wrapped his hand in a bandage while remembering his opponent in the tournament. He recognized her strength. Smiling faintly, Theodore clenched his fist. He admired geniuses like Sylvia. Looking at the hand where Glutton was, Theodore recalled how arrogantly he thought that he had become much stronger. But it turned out that even this was not enough. Vince, sitting in a chair on the side, watched Theodore clutching his hand. Extending his hand towards Theodore, who was sitting nearby, Vince suggested celebrating the victory rather than praising Sylvia. Theodore raised his head by talking about the victory that seemed so unreal to him. The professor in his red glasses looked with a faint smile at Theodore and asked if he could get up. Vince stood up and picked up the suit. He wanted to help Theodore, who had never worn a suit before. Theodore stood up, leaning on the armrest of the sofa. Vince scratched his chin with his hand and assessed Theodore's appearance with a smile on his face. Theodore stood in front of the professor with his hair combed back and wearing a suit. He was a little embarrassed in such formal clothes. Vince turned away from him, ignoring the complaints of the crying Theodore. He said to just be patient until the end of the award ceremony. Taking his red raincoat, Vince said that it would be okay to go in regular clothes. Theodore turned his head looking at the professor. He asked why he was wearing a suit then. Vince turned his head while talking about the recent rumors. People were saying that the king would be at the award ceremony, so a suit was a must. We are transported to Pentarium Square. The red carpet led to the podium where the award ceremony will take place. Theodore was worried while standing in the crowd. Vince, who was standing next to him, asked about Theodore's well-being. He assured Vince that he was fine. Theodore, standing behind Vince, was talking with one of the magicians. He was very nervous about the king's personal appearance. Theodore looked up at the podium, waiting. Many people sitting in the stands were waiting for the king. The crowd shouted, welcoming the king and the candidates for the award. The huge gate in front of Vince and Theodore rose, opening the way for them to the podium. Theodore noticed the specificity of the audience. His eyes narrowed, sweat began to flow from his face. Vince himself was excited by the appearance of bureaucrats from many departments. He couldn't believe it. Even the three most powerful families of the kingdom were also here. A few moments later, all the candidates, including Theodore, stood on the podium with their hands behind their backs. Theodore was nervous, his lips were trembling, because the strongest people in the kingdom had gathered. Theodore tried to restrain himself and not disgrace himself. Sylvia leaned forward a little and looked at Theodore in surprise. She became embarrassed and returned her head to its original position. But after a second she leaned over again and looked at Theodore with a smile. Theodore winked at Sylvia with one eye, his mood lifted. Theodore understood, worry couldn't help him. When the speaker spoke, Theodore's attention immediately switched. He turned his head towards the sound. The figure of the king emerged from the open gate. The king walked to the podium along a red carpet, on the sides of which stood soldiers holding flags. Kurt walked forward proudly and evenly and scratched his beard with one hand. Kurt stood on the podium, wearing a black suit and a yellow coat, scratching his beard and looking down at the candidates. Everyone in the area bowed their heads in greeting to their king. Kurt turned his head and greeted Blundell standing next to Vince, reminiscent of their last meeting that took place 3 months ago. Blundell became a little flustered and greeted the king back. Kurt smiled faintly, reminding Blundell that if Blundell hadn't skipped the meeting without warning, they would have been able to see each other much sooner. Listening to the king's words, Blundell began to cough and covered his mouth with his hand. Asking about his vacation, Kurt closed his eyes and said that he wanted to see how much effort Blundell put into raising her. When the king asked if Blundell had really been hiding his student for 10 years, Blundell turned to Vince, turning away from Kurt out of shame. A subordinate approached the king and said that he would now begin to announce their names. Kurt pointed to himself and said with a smile on his face that he would announce the candidates himself. Theodore, who bowed his head in front of Kurt, was not pondering the king's love for pretentiousness, which many talked about. The king presented the award to the candidate from the Tower of Water with a huge blue hat on his head. The guy bowed his head thanking Kurt for the reward. The guy walked past Kurt, and Sylvia and Theodore remained kneeling in front of the king. Kurt announced Sylvia, calling her a student. Blundell asked to come over. Sylvia raised her head and began to stand up. As Sylvia approached, Kurt began to announce Sylvia's reward as the finalist of the student tournament. He was giving her 100 gold coins, a Jack Frost staff and the title of Baroness as a reward. Taking the Frost staff in her hands, Sylvia brought it to her chest and thanked the king. Finally, Kurt began to announce Theodore, who was kneeling, and asked him to come over. When Theodore stood in front of Kurt, he immediately began to talk about the reward that he was giving him as the winner of the student tournament. He gave Theodore as a reward 100 gold coins, a protection bracelet, and awarded him the title of Baron. When Theodore began to thank the king, Kurt raised his finger to his lips, with his gesture telling Theodore to be silent. Sweat began to run down Theodore's face and he pursed his lips, all because of the king, who said that with due diligence, Theodore's title would be promoted to Viscount. Theodore grabbed and raised Jack Frost's staff, bringing it to his face and thanked the king for the reward. Sylvia and Theodore knelt in front of Kurt. Kurt smiled contentedly and scratched his beard. Kurt spread his legs a little wider. With his arms outstretched, Kurt spoke about their kingdom of Melter, bordered by the Narcan mountain range in the northeast and the Andres Empire in the northwest. To protect the country from cruel imperialists and the forces of evil, the country needed young magicians like Theodore and Sylvia. Kurt ordered the mage community to spread the word about today's event and never stop cultivating future talents. He furiously asked if everyone understood his decree. Shouts were heard throughout the podium about the readiness to carry out the order. Kurt stood on the pedestal looking at the people. After the award ceremony, Theodore ate a lot. His stomach expanded from the amount of food he had eaten. Vince, who was sitting next to him, praised the food for its taste. Theodore crossed his arms and agreed with Vince, who rested his head on his hand and looked at Theodore. Theodore and Vince sat silently at the table and looked at each other. The next second, both extended their arms with their thumbs up, showing it to each other. Theodore threw his head back, his eyes closed. A smile appeared on his face. Today was a wonderful day for Theodore. Vince, who was sitting next to him, smiled. He was also pleased with today. When Theodore separated the palms of his hands, the glutton called Theodore, shouting. Theodore looked at the glutton, who complained of hunger and ordered him to bring him something to eat. Theodore grabbed a book with a red cover, wanting to feed it to the glutton. The glutton began to absorb books, turning them into sand, including books such as The Power of Wind and Sand. The magic of the fourth circle sandstorm was learned from it. The magic of the third circle resistance to cold was absorbed from the book Survival in the Cold. All knowledge poured into Theodore's head. The glutton in his hand, after devouring 2 books, asked Theodore what was needed from him. Theodore looked at the glutton, the shadow of his hair covering his eyes. Theodore, looking at the glutton, asked the reason for the change in his speech. Glutton looked at Theodore in confusion as he listened to him tell how Glutton paused between words. The glutton explained, remembering everything he had eaten. It was all thanks to the fact that recently, Theodore fed him a huge amount of artifacts. This was not enough to move on to the next round, but quite enough to get rid of his stuttering. Theodore, looking at Glutton, did not even think about such an opportunity to get rid of Glutton's stutter. Sticking out his tongue, Glutton said that he was simply regaining his abilities. Theodore frowned. Looking at Glutton, he wanted to ask him about something else. Glutton looked at Theodore incomprehensibly, asking what he wanted to ask him about. Theodore's eyes almost closed. He looked at the Glutton with some sadness. The Glutton stuck out his tongue, making fun of Theodore. Theodore and Vince, who was watching from the side, were a little surprised. Looking away, Glutton began to explain the meaning of the joke, but an irritated Theodore shouted at him, saying that he already knew what a joke was. Theodore looked down at Glutton and asked if he could pass the question to another. The Glutton looked at Theodore and smiled. It was interesting for him. Sticking out his tongue, Glutton said that he was the first user who asked for this and there was nothing forbidden in the action itself. Raising his hand with Glutton in his palm, Theodore turned to Vince, who had approached him, and informed him that Glutton was not against the question. Vince's eyes looked at Glutton. Vince asked him if he could call him Glutton. The Glutton, with his tongue hanging out, looked up at Vince and responded by saying that he didn't care about such minor issues and could call him whatever he wanted. Vince raised his hand and decided to ask his question. Scratching his chin, Vince asked with a smile how language and magic are connected. The Glutton began his story of the past, when the elves lived for thousands of years in the distant past, when the concept of magic existed, long before people came up with a name for it. Dragons have lived for tens of thousands of years. The demons who bound themselves into a false eternity and the countless races in the form of a black mass under the demon all used magic under different names. However, only man was born in the womb and was born without any power. Therefore, people stole the songs of the elves. People forged iron like dwarves, and sometimes they even repeated demonic rituals by turning into skeletons. Several thousand years later, the first circle appeared on the hands of man and the concept of a circle was finally formed. Then, for the first time since the beginning of the world, magicians were born among people. Thousands of years have passed since then. The Glutton looked at Vince and said that this was too broad a question and his whole life would not be enough to listen to the answer to it. Vince stood in front of Theodore, who was sitting, and asked Gluttony in Theodore's hand if it was possible to limit the information to the language of people. But Gluttony said that the amount of information exceeded the limit allowed for the question. Vince was unhappy. He asked another question, asking him to tell him why the words of the ancient and modern languages produce different magical effects. In Theodore's raised hand, Glutton closed his eyes contentedly. He decided to clarify one thing first. Theodore and Vince watched, listening to the Glutton's words. From his words one could understand that magic was an act of persuasion of the magical forces of the world. It could be compared to a sincere request for her to act. Vince, listening to Glutton, realized that the belief sounded plausible. The Glutton on Theodore's hand with his tongue hanging out continued. The concept of language that Vince asked about included the ability to persuade. The closer the magician was to mastering the world, the more the world began to listen to his voice. Vince bowed his head a little. For him, magic based on ancient languages is stronger and more effective than modern magic. Vince scratched his chin with his hand, not understanding the principle of the ancient language. The Glutton in Theodore's hand said that language is a contradictory medium. Vince looked attentively at Glutton through his glasses, listening to his words. Theodore tilted his body, sitting down like a schoolboy at his desk. Vince stood nearby, continuing to listen to Glutton. He spoke about a condition in which when the number of users decreased, the strength increased. But if there were very few or no users, the meaning of the ancient language became unclear. Theodore was enveloped in clouds of mana spread out in the room. He looked at Vince, who overcame the wall of the sixth circle. Theodore clenched his fist and smiled. It was a great honor for him to see the exaltation live. Theodore looked at his hand where Glutton was. He told him in an orderly tone to go to bed. The sleepy Glutton looked sadly at Theodore and asked to be spared. Theodore, looking at him, asked what he needed. Theodore was wondering what happened to the Glutton, who always fell asleep as soon as he finished his work. Pleased that he was not driven away, Glutton stuck out his tongue and said that he would give advice to strengthen Theodore, otherwise at this rate he would soon die before opening all the seals. Theodore looked a little nervously at his raised hand and asked the Glutton to tell everything. Half of Theodore's hair turned purple. He looked at the Glutton, who wanted to teach him one hidden function without any conditions. Glutton recalled that gluttony was the absorption of magical books and the use of abilities from them, the second skill of absorbing rare books, and the last skill is memory for storing magical knowledge and spells in the brain. Theodore looked at the open-mouthed Glutton who spoke about functions and skills. Theodore at this time was thinking about the hidden function. Theodore bit the lower part of his lip. He, without taking his eyes off, watched and listened to everything that Glutton did and said. The Glutton on his hand showed malice on his small round face. Theodore raised his hand with Glutton almost to the height of his head and turned his head looking at him. He asked what the catch was. After Theodore's question, Glutton became lethargic again, bowing to sleep. Glutton complained about Theodore's paranoia. Vince approached Theodore, who was sitting with his hands in his pocket. The Glutton told him a way to quickly increase strength. For this it was necessary to improve the quality of food. It was as if lightning struck Theodore's body from the terrible words of the Glutton, who accused him of never feeding the Glutton with rare books, with the exception of ballistic magic and the basics of elemental magic. Theodore smiled faintly, ashamed of his words. He understood everything. Remembering how he had recently fed him 2 rare books, which then turned into sand and merged with Glutton, Theodore understood that those were the only books of the rare class that he had fed to Glutton all the time. Theodore folded his hands and sat and thought. There was no point in disagreeing with Glutton's words, given that he wanted to increase his strength and needed to feed Glutton with rare books. Theodore's gaze became serious. He could activate a hidden function in such an obvious way. No matter what he thought about it, this exchange was incredibly important to him. Theodore placed his hand with Glutton on the table again. Vince stood next to him. They both listened to the conditions for activating the hidden function. Sticking out his tongue, the Glutton said that by luck, what could activate the function was located next to him. Theodore looked at the Glutton with incomprehension and asked what it was. The Glutton slyly looked up at Theodore and named the necessary thing. Theodore, having heard the condition, did not immediately understand what he was talking about and simply looked at the Glutton in his hand. But then his face distorted with various emotions, his lips trembled, he shouted why this was necessary. After a while, the mana around Vince, who was sitting clutching his head with one hand, began to dissipate. Leaning with one hand on the table, Vince exhaled in relief. Theodore sat next to him all this time, turning his head watching Vince. Vince removed his hand from his face. In the room, the mana that had come out of Vince's body enveloped everything. Theodore, who was sitting next to him, extended his hand and congratulated Vince, from whose body it came mana. Theodore and Vince shook hands, thanking each other. Shaking the hand of Theodore, who was sitting next to him, Vince said that if he had studied everything on his own, he would have wasted another 10 years, and maybe more. Their meeting at the Burgeon Academy was his greatest success. Theodore smiled, but could not help but notice a slight exaggeration on Vince's part, but he insisted that he was telling the truth. The question that Vince asked Glutton set back developments in archaeology for a whole decade. Vince didn't let go of Theodore's hand, saying that he couldn't believe it, because he was finally rewarded for all the years of waiting. Theodore looked at his hand. He remembered his recent conversation with the Glutton. The Glutton then asked him to feed him the spatial pocket. Space pockets in the form of a small pouch were too expensive. Space magic had to be a minimum of the 6th circle. In this case, a certain amount of space had to be sewn into a pocket. It was too complicated. Only the highest ranked magicians representing towers or kingdoms could buy this. Theodore looked down. His thoughts were only about the complexity loot and the value of the spatial pocket that the Glutton asked to feed him. Vince turned his head and asked Theodore if something was bothering him. Theodore, putting his hand to his mouth, was wondering whether it was worth telling Vince about the condition. Vince tilted his head as Theodore pretended to forget his question. Theodore smiled, but inside he was very nervous. He made a decision. If necessary, he would feed low-quality things to Glutton. Vince gathered his hands together and turned his head to Theodore, looking at him. Due to sudden enlightenment, Vince forgot to tell him something and now wanted to do it. Theodore looked at the professor with a question in his eye. Vince closed his eyes hidden behind his glasses and smilingly asked Theodore not to think of it as a burden. Vince extended his hand, calling Theodore by his full name. Vince stood with his hand outstretched in front of Theodore and asked him to become his heir. Theodore, who was sitting, not believing what he heard, asked Vince, who was standing next to him, what he said. Vince's lips curved into a faint smile, showing neat white teeth. Vince wanted to include Theodore's name in his family tree. He told Theodore this. Theodore's eyes widened in shock. Sweat began to run down his face. Theodore looked at Vince in a stupor. Theodore bowed his head and asked if he was exactly the right person for this. Vince, who was standing, said that Theodore could consider this as cowardice. He shamelessly hunted for the knowledge of the grimoire and was not going to deny it. Theodore's lips tightened and he bit them non-stop, not answering Vince's question about trust in him. Vince bowed his head a little, his eyes were closed, and there was a smile on his face. He had been wanting to ask Theodore this for a long time. Theodore's lips stopped curling. He raised his head, thinking about Vince's words, but how could he ask him not to consider it a burden? But Theodore stood up and shook Vince's outstretched hand. Theodore, bowing his head a little with a smile, asked to take care of him in the future. Vince's green eyes looked through his glasses at Theodore. For him, he was no longer a professor. The shadow of the figures of Vince and Theodore was visible from the window. Vince said to call him master from now on. Near the building of the Red Tower, the road to which passed through a kind of iron berm. Vince and Theodore stood in front of the building looking at the posters, Vince telling them that at least the attacking magic of the year organized by the Red Tower was good. Sticking one hand out of his pocket, Vince continued to speak. Theodore looked at him. Listening carefully, Vince thought that Theodore should not go there. There were many who took pleasure in crushing young talents. Suddenly, a girl's voice was heard behind Vince and Theodore. They immediately turned around, looking at the arrival. Scratching her head, the girl bowed in greeting. She introduced herself. Her name was Merlos. She was from the Blue Tower. Merlos was specifically looking for Vince and Theodore. Raising the letter in her hand, Merlos asked to walk with her. The head of the Blue Tower called them to him. After some time, they were already near the Blue Tower building. The entire street and the air in the area were surrounded by fog. Vince and Theodore walked inside the tower where many of the Blue Tower's mages were doing their daily work. As Vince and Theodore passed by people, Theodore asked why he felt so much attention on himself. Vince concluded by saying that apparently he became a celebrity after yesterday's competition. Theodore and Vince did not stop walking. Theodore's eye looked towards the people watching. He asked Vince what he should do. Vince advised him to ignore and not pay attention to the looks and excessive attention of people. Vince climbed up the circular staircase. Theodore looked out the window with of great height fell behind him a little. The door to the office of the head of the Blue Tower swung open. When Theodore and Vince entered the office, the head of the Blue Tower greeted them. Blundell, scratching his beard, apologized for calling so early. Blundell's blue eye looked at Vince seriously. He saw the red oppressive atmosphere around Vince, as well as his heart blazing with fire. Blundell laughed. He asked Vince about his breakthrough. Vince tried to hide his breakthrough by not understanding what he was asking about. Throwing his head back, Blundell laughed even harder. Who was he to deceive the eyes of the Lord of the Blue Tower? But even so, Blundell congratulated Vince, who had stood in a stupor. Blundell picked up a bowl of tea from the table. Vince stood with his arms crossed and leaning on the table, looking with Theodore at Blundell, who was sitting in a chair in his blue robe. Blundell asked permission to ask a question. After Vince gave it, Blundell said the numbers 932 and 1106, causing Vince to look at him more closely. Blundell tilted his head a little and asked with a smirk if Vince knew the meaning of these numbers, each of them the number of people who were looking for information respectively about Vince and Theodore since yesterday. Vince asked Blundell with some apprehension. Blundell, who was sitting, assured Vince not to worry, because he had already foreseen everything long ago and blocked all information about them, and only Kurt could access this information. Vince asked the question of how he knew that this would happen. Blundell told how every year people continued to try to recruit promising participants. Vince's mood worsened and he hunched over a little due to his rage. Filled with rage, Vince recalled how he left the capital out of disgust at such political moments, but they still had the audacity to want his heir. Theodore got scared and pulled back a little watching Vince. He was shocked by the heat caused by the unintentional release of magic. Blundell raised his hand and with a few strokes of his palm dispelled Vince's fiery mana. Blundell asked him to stop getting excited and calm down. Blundell, with his hand raised, explained to Vince that even as a magician of the Sixth Circle, his power would not be enough to overturn the political order of the world, because resisting those in power was not the smartest decision. Theodore's pupils shrank. He was shocked by what he saw. Blundell cooled the air with just one gesture. Vince asked Blundell, who was sitting, what he would do if he found himself in such a situation. Blundell thought about the answer, scratching his nose. He would kill everyone. That was his decision. He was a magician of the Eighth Circle. There was no need for his mind to worry about such trifles. Vince and Theodore opened their mouths in fear, profuse sweat flowing down their faces. They did not expect Blundell to turn out like this. Blundell laughed. It was his joke. He put one hand inside his robe, saying that he had prepared something for them. Blundell took out a red envelope. It was an order. Vince was surprised and reminded him of Theodore's rank, which was listed as basic. Blundell held the order in his hand and showed it to Vince and Theodore, who were standing nearby. He said that it was better than hold up in his room until the end of the magic competition. Blundell suggested that they take a break. He turned to Theodore and asked him when he was last in his house. Hearing Theodore's surprise, Blundell closed one of his eyes and smiled. Theodore listened in shock that the Miller Barony turned out to be the destination. On Blundell's desk lay many scrolls and items necessary for writing. Vince Theodore stood, considering the proposal of Blundell, who was sitting in front of them. Stretching his hand with the envelope a little forward, Blundell began the story of how one of the magicians was sent to explore a cave found in the barony of Miller. He ordered Vince and Theodore to inspect everything there properly. While Theodore opened the order and began to read it, Blundell said that it was not even a dungeon, but an ordinary cave that they found 3 months ago. They sent one magician guy to explore it. Theodore, who was reading the order, interrupted Blundell, saying that contact with the guy had been lost, and Blundell, who was sitting with folded hands, confirmed his words. Blundell, scratching his beard, told Theodore that they would not have to strain themselves too much. They would just relax in their hometown, not paying attention to the rumors, but if they did find the magician, it would be nice to return with him. Vince looked at Theodore. Theodore, with the order in his hands, stared at Vince. Theodore agreed to carry out the order. A smile appeared on his face. If this was all that was required, he could handle it himself. Blundell threw his head back, clenched one hand into a fist, shouting that it would be one thing if that magician broke the connection unintentionally, but if not. Vince and Theodore looked at Blundell, worried and scared. Vince asked why he suddenly spoke like that. Blundell snapped his fingers as he continued to levitate. He said that he had found a suitable companion for Theodore. Sylvia carefully stuck part of her body behind the cabinet. Theodore noticed her out of the corner of his eye. Blundell called out to Sylvia. Sylvia, dressed in the standard Blue Tower uniform, began to approach them. When Sylvia approached, she lowered her eyes and greeted Theodore. Because of this, her face turned red with embarrassment. Theodore turned completely, looking at her in shock. Theodore walked away from Sylvia, pressing himself against the lockers behind him. Blundell spoke about the excessive attention to Sylvia, and then Theodore realized that Sylvia was his companion. Sylvia, blushing a little, grabbed Theodore's finger. Theodore turned away and began to say goodbye to everyone, but Blundell stopped him with shouts. Blundell grabbed Theodore by the shoulder, startling him. Blundell said that Sylvia had absolutely no idea how to make friends and was a child at heart. Her magical abilities are excellent. However, she was a child in mind, so Blundell would like to help her gain some communication experience through this journey. He asked Theodore to help him a little. Theodore turned his head and asked Blundell whether it was too self-willed for an adult guy and girl to go on a trip together. Blundell put one arm around Theodore and leaned over to explain to him as he had said. She is a child and does not yet know what the opposite sex is. Her interest was caused solely by a feeling of similarity. Sylvia tilted her head back, trying to hear the conversation. Blundell and Theodore, realizing this, became nervous and stopped talking. Blundell grabbed Theodore by the shoulder and pulled him away. Soon they came to a table with many things lying on it. Blundell took in his hand the badge of the magical society used as identification, and according to the rank of this badge, a reward was received. Covering his badge with his hand, Blundell said that Theodore's mission was listed as a level 9 mission, the lowest rank, so the pay was only 3 gold pieces. The badge in Blundell's hand has changed. It is his responsibility to give Theodore this badge. Theodore asked about the reward. Blundell, holding the badge in his hand, said that the reward would be 100 gold with this badge. Theodore exclaimed inside, his eyes never leaving the badge in Blundell's hand. Looking at him, Theodore thought about a large sum of money, enough to cover the Miller family's budget for several years. Theodore remembered the terribly low yield on the farm. He even remembered how many people were dying of hunger. If Theodore gave the 200 gold pieces he had in his hand from the tournament prize, he would provide substantial assistance to his impoverished house. Theodore, in Blundell's arms, agreed to take Sylvia with him, Sylvia herself trying to lean back enough to follow them. Blundell patted Theodore on the shoulder, making him nervous. Blundell said that this was a great opportunity to learn something for him too, because it's not every day that you get the opportunity to be accompanied by a fifth circle magician. Looking at Sylvia, who was still bending down trying to see something, Theodore became worried about what people would say when he returned home with a cute girl and a hefty sum of 300 gold. Sylvia smiled and showed 2 fingers on her hand, thereby expressing her interest. A little later at the exit from the capital, next to the carriage, Vince stood opposite Anna thanking her for the service. Anna said that it was nothing. For the sake of such a request as this, she would do everything to help. Anna approached Vince, who asked her not to be so close to him. Anna closed her eyes. Saliva escaped from the corner of her mouth. She was too happy. Because her fiancé already wore 6 circles on his clothes, she couldn't wait to become the wife of the Supreme Mage. Vince, looking at Anna, became nervous. He didn't like her look. He didn't understand what she even wanted from him. Vince turned his head half a turn and wished Theodore a good rest behind him. Against the background of the capital from the top plan, Vince expressed his thoughts by saying that after the competition in the capital, those people who disturb them will go to their lands, and after that they will all be able to focus on magic. Vince grinned, reminding Theodore to take care of the spatial pocket. If he loses it, an investigator will be sent for the magic cast on this pocket, and money will be collected from him for the cost of his work. Theodore listened to Vince's words with an awkward smile. Theodore imagined how the glutton swallowed the spatial pocket. Invisible sweat began to flow down his face. Theodore only hoped that he would not be sent to the hearing. Theodore raised his hand to his face and calmed himself down, promising Vince that he would take care of the spatial pocket. The coachman looked behind the cart and asked Vince if they were ready to leave. Theodore walked past Vince, turning their heads towards each other. They said goodbye. The carriage moved, raising dust. Vince remained standing in place, looking after the carriage. The carriages raced along the road at great speed. Theodore sat in the carriage with his head resting on his hand, which he rested on the wall of the carriage. If they continued to travel at this speed, they would arrive at the Miller barony in 5 days. But they had a problem with the awkwardness between him and Sylvia, who was sitting opposite. Although looking at Sylvia, Theodore understood that she did not understand what the opposite sex was, but still, in such a situation, he could not help but feel awkward. Suddenly it dawned on Theodore, who was resting his head on his hand in thought. Theodore leaned forward a little and asked Sylvia if she liked elementals. Sylvia asked blankly about elementals. Theodore extended his hand to the side to summon Mithra. Mithra appeared with small pieces of earth in the air. Sylvia looked at Mithra in surprise. Sylvia brought Mithra to her in her arms and was captivated by her cuteness. Theodore closed his eyes and smiled contentedly. Fortunately for him, Sylvia behaved like a girl her age. If she had seen Mithra as a full-fledged magician, it would have been a complete failure. Mithra, hovering next to Sylvia, tickled her. Sylvia bent over a little and closed one of her eyes because of the tickling. Day gave way to night. Sunset was approaching. Theodore looked out the carriage window. It was already the 4th day. They should arrive at the Miller barony tomorrow. Sylvia called out to Theodore and he looked at her. She asked what it was like, his hometown. Theodore crossed his arms. He decided to answer Sylvia, who was sitting opposite, as simply as possible and briefly called his city a village. The residents farmed every year, and there were mountains and forests all around. When wild animals came down from the mountains from time to time, people hunted and had a feast. Raising his finger, Theodore said that their life is not rich, but they are not averse to sharing with their neighbors. This is the place where fools like him live. Sylvia covered her smile with her hand and said it was a good place. Theodore closed his eyes, remembering the past and agreeing with Sylvia. Theodore looked out the window. He was in anticipation that he would soon meet his mother and father. Theodore clenched his teeth and trembled. He took part in an eerie mana. Sylvia also felt something. Theodore looked sharply out the window and cast a Hawkeye spell. Outside the carriage window, many lights were visible from the eye sockets, which were hidden in the forest. The troll's foot came out of the forest. Monsters with various weapons in their hands began to come out of the forest. Theodore and Sylvia looked out the window. Theodore opened his mouth in shock. He did not understand where the monsters came from here. The goblins began to rustle in the foliage, quickly approaching their goal. They looked at the caravan that was driving straight ahead. Theodore Miller looked straight at Sylvia with a serious face in disgust. Sylvia looked at the main character awkwardly. Theodore noted that Andronicus should take the right one, and he would take the left one. Nodding, the girl said that she understood. An army of goblins ran out to the caravans, some of them began to jump onto the trains, and there was a noise from the raid. Someone shouted that the monsters were approaching them, and noted that everyone should pay attention to this. A huge bunch of goblins jumped onto one of the trains, and it began to stagger. Suddenly some mysterious force struck them, and they flew back. Bolt. All the trains overturned. Heavy dust rose from their fall. Sylvia and the main character began to get out of the littered trains. Someone began to moan a little in pain while the main character tried to pull him out. He shouted for the coachman to wake up quickly and began to revive him. After making sure that the man had woken up, Miller walked away from him, but continued to watch until he was unhappy. Theodore noted that the man should not interfere since he and Sylvia could handle the monsters, and added that he should take everyone away from here and also ordered them to hide. A bald man with yellow glasses said he understood. Theodore looked at the monsters. Among them were creepy smiling goblins, licking kobolds, and evil orcs, all of them looking at the overturned cart. The main character stood surrounded by all these monsters. While they made incomprehensible sounds, the sky was illuminated by moonlight. Miller noted in his thoughts that, fortunately, huge monsters were still not visible, and added that he did not feel the sorcerer's aura. Miller blew into his palm and a small ball of flame appeared in his hand. The flame began to increase and spread in space. Miller looked at the dead with a serious expression on his face. He noted that nothing could be done if this happened. He began to direct a small stream of energy to his webbed fingers, and the energy formed a small firewall. With a quick upward movement of his hand, Theodore launched this ball into the sky, and the rays emanating from it began to hit their opponents directly on target, starting to burn them. Theodore shouted for all these dead to be burned to the ground. Theodore looked carefully at his palm and at the monsters. He noted that the physical indicators of these dead are low, and added that they even fight without weapons. Miller noted in his reasoning that at this rate they will cope with 1,000 more such monsters. Miller lowered his hands. In the background there were sounds of rumble, monsters appeared, and at the same time someone's loud stomping was heard. In an instant, the protagonist's eyes narrowed and sweat started running down his face. A huge troll with a mace ran towards them. Weaker monsters scattered away from him in different directions. The main character screamed in horror. Thinking that this was a troll, he noticed that the necromancers had not yet shown up. The troll jumped straight towards the main character. He brought his buzova behind his back. A lot of dust rose from his jump, while the main character looked straight at him. Miller noted that he shouldn't waste the circle's fiery shell. The main character fell. He sat and looked straight into the eyes of an angry troll, who quickly began to lower his mace. The main character was very tense. He put his hands in front of him. Miller noted in a dissatisfied tone that magic bullets could not cope with the undead. The troll was pleased and bent right over Miller. His mace blow missed. Miller sat and defended himself as best he could, but then Sylvia's blue aura appeared in the form of a dragon's head. Sylvia's attack went straight to Troll, who began to fall back screaming. Theodore was amazed by what happened. Drops of water scattered in different directions. He asked himself in his thoughts whether he had just seen a water serpent. The water snake began to twist its body right around the troll until he began to choke and screamed in pain. The water serpent froze and turned into ice, along with the troll imprisoned in its watery prison, which froze into a diamond shape. The main character looked directly at Adrunkus in shock while she stood opposite him with a serious look, holding her magic staff in her hand. He sighed and noted that this could also be done. Miller winked at Sylvia and showed her the class with an awkward smile. He noted that the water serpent was a 4th level spell and quite effective, and added that she did her job well in such conditions. Sylvia smiled tenderly, but looked at Theodore with a grin. She said that her grandfather had told her exactly the same thing before. Miller put his fist directly to his lips and closed his eyes. Noting that it was control magic that was used, he became thoughtful. The main character called Mirtha and at the same time crossed his legs while Sylvia watched them. Theodore noted, asking Mirtha if she could do something similar, just like Adrunkus. Mirtha put on a serious face, clenched her hands into fists, and made a sound of agreement. Suddenly, clots of earth began to make noise and rise a little. A huge worm, which consisted of earth and stones, crawled out of the ground and growled menacingly while the main character sat with his hand extended. He noted that it was an earthworm. Sylvia was delighted with such a large creature. Her mouth began to water. "Wow," she said. The monsters that stood nearby looked at this worm with horror. Miller looked at Sylvia as she looked at him intently. The girl asked the main character, calling him by name, if he could really control an earthworm. Theodore grinned and looked at his spirit Mirtha. He asked her if she heard Sylvia's question just now. The worm rose higher and higher and came out. He screamed while pieces of earth and stones flew down from him, while the main character calmly sat on a stone and looked at him. His monster moved to the side. Sylvia's cheeks turned red with delight as she carefully watched the actions of Miller and the worm. She noted that this cannot be. Theodore agreed with her. He sat with a grin on a stone. Without changing his position, the main character only moved his hand. Miller noted by saying that he is the creator of this worm. The earthen creature moved and growled. Theodore added that this worm is controlled by Mirtha. The worm crawled out to its full length from the ground with a very loud sound. Theodore angrily clenched his hand into a fist and looked towards the dead. He noted that it didn't matter what size the summoned beast was, as long as he could still control it. The earthworm quickly crawled towards the monsters, simultaneously hitting the ground to increase its speed. The worm hovered directly over a bunch of goblins, who were looking around, but many were looking at the creature created by the main character. The worm suddenly rushed head down, stones and pieces of trees mixed with the ground flew off from its body in different directions. The main character, along with Sylvia, watched this spectacle while the earthworm crushed their enemies. The main character could barely control the state of the worm. It was difficult for him and he was tense. Adruncus was delighted with all this. She noted that this spectacle is incredible, and she also added that Miller crushed the dead. Sylvia directed her gaze at the main character and was shocked. Miller was lying on the ground completely exhausted. Sylvia quickly ran up to him and lifted him up by the shoulder. The girl was alarmed for Miller while he was covered in sweat and blood was flowing from his mouth. The girl asked him with concern how he was feeling and if he was okay. The main character did not say anything. It was difficult for him, and Sylvia continued to call him. In his thoughts, Theodore noted that it seemed to him that he had overdone it a little, and noted with satisfaction that he was glad that he could still do it, and added that next time he would do it much better. Theodore began to regain consciousness. He directed his gaze somewhere. He kept making mental notes that he still had a lot of improvement to do, so he wouldn't rush it. Suddenly, from the trees, someone began to shout and wave their arms, while Sylvia and the main character looked in his direction in surprise. The man began to ask the magicians whether they had already dealt with all the terrible dead or not. The main character sat down. He looked at the man coachman carefully. He noted that for now they had defeated everyone, but added that there could be many more monsters and they should leave as soon as possible. A bald man with glasses put his hand to his head as if he was obeying. He noted that he accepted Miller's order and added that everything would be done right away. The main character was sitting in the caravan. He leaned his face back into his hands. He thought about the undead and forced himself to calm down. Miller noted that judging by the number of monsters, they appeared quite recently, and added that this means that necromancers have just appeared here. The sun was already setting, and Miller still sat bent over. He continued to note in his mind that it didn't really matter how far away the Miller barony was. He noted that he must have at least heard something about such a disaster in these parts. He was very tense and puzzled. What a horror, he said in his thoughts. The caravan drove forward further and further. The windows were already beginning to glow. The main character used a technique, an eagle gaze, and looked straight along the caravans. A map of the area appeared in his head, where the road was marked with a red arrow. He noted that there were a total of 5 hills between the attacked area and the Miller barony. Theodore Miller thought carefully. He added that they had now passed the 4th hill. He opened his eyes and looked straight. Theodore noted that it turned out that they only had one last hill to go through. Abruptly, Miller stood up from his seat and looked at Sylvia as she looked at him. The girl asked him if they had already arrived at the place. The main character noted that they were almost there. He sat down directly on the window railing in his composition. He looked carefully at Adruncus. Theodore Miller turned to Sylvia. He noted, asking that at his signal she would stop the caravan, and added that he hoped that nothing terrible had happened, and noted that he had a bad feeling. Adruncus looked at Miller carefully. She gave her consent and asked him what his plan was. He responded and looked at Sylvia. He noted that he would knock on the roof 3 times, and then showed how he would knock. Theodore pushed off the sofa with his foot and opened the door of his train, sitting at the same time on the window frame. He grabbed the roof of the caravan with a sharp movement while it made uncontrollable noise from the speed of travel. In an instant, Miller used a first-class grapple spell and latched onto the roof of the caravan as it continued to travel at high speed. Miller directed his gaze directly, his eyes frowning. He used the eagle gaze spell while casting it. His vision improved and he videoed a beautiful landscape. After milliseconds, he began to look further and further. His eyes narrowed. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. Theodore Miller stood up and covered his eyes with his jacket sleeve. He was unpleasantly shocked. In his thoughts he said, "This is it." Miller yelled at the man to hurry up. Theodore was angry and dissatisfied. Sweat began to flow down his face. The protagonist's gaze looked further and further. He spoke unflatteringly because of his shock. Miller looked straight. His eyes narrowed. He saw a fierce battle going on ahead of them. The undead fought with the villagers. Many were already defeated on both sides. Theodore asked himself in his thoughts that they were really fighting monsters. Miller stood and watched as the caravan drove faster and faster. Sweat began to flow down Theodore's cheek. In his thoughts, he continued to note that he could not believe what he had just seen. He asked himself how the inhabitants could resist such an army of the undead. Theodore Miller looked at one of the residents, who smiled mischievously while waving his sword. The blonde man shouted that he would make all monsters regret that they were born into this world. Another defender of the village was a striking owner of a long beard. He kicked the goblin, who began to serve. He screamed for these monsters to choke on their helplessness. Theodore was shocked by what he saw. His eyes narrowed further. He noted in his thoughts that these were really not villagers, but still mercenaries, and added that they were very skilled mercenaries. The main character continued to examine the surroundings, which were posts for the caravan. He noted that thanks to these mercenaries, their road to the village is still safe for the inhabitants of the caravan. Miller quickly ran up to a bald man with glasses. He was a caravan driver. The main character began to ask him to go forward straight to the village and quickly. The coachman, out of surprise, asked him again and asked what about the main character himself. The main character ran up to his train, in which Sylvia was sitting. He knocked 3 times, and Sylvia opened the door of the train, starting to look for Theodore. Theodore continued to shout towards the evening not to worry about him and drove as hard as he could as fast as he could. A drunkess jumped straight onto Theodore's roof as a strong wind whipped towards them, both of them looking straight ahead. The main character became even more wary while Sylvia was seriously looking in the same direction as Miller. They stood straight and looked towards the village. Theodore Miller noted that now it was their turn to begin. Theodore clasped his hands together and an aura of fire began to swirl around him as he cast spells. Miller added that memory is the 3rd slot. He clasped his hands closer together and clenched his teeth as he pointed his palms towards the mercenaries to attack the monsters. Miller shouted, "Triple arrow." The protagonist spread his arms as an arrow made of fire flew skyward with a whistling sound. The mercenaries saw a huge number of fire arrows flying from side to side as they fought. One of them shouted, asking what was happening here, and added whether these were fire arrows. Another mercenary shouted back to him that he was apparently right, which means there was a magician somewhere nearby with them. Sylvia raised her staff above her head and looked at that battlefield with confidence. She screamed, "The arrow is an icicle." The ice arrows mixed with the fire arrows and flew along the same trajectory. The mercenaries were very shocked by what they saw and even scared. Some of them shouted that the arrows were approaching from the side and asked their friends not to fall under this fire. The mercenaries watched in horror, their eyes narrowed. One of them asked what they needed because enemies were attacking them. Sylvia and Theodore stood together and supported such a strong flow of arrows. They were filled with confidence in their actions, their brows were furrowed and they were starting to get a little tired from the more mana used. An explosion of the fusion of 2 elements that sounded very loud. The mercenaries, fighting the monsters, did not take their eyes off what was happening. Their battle proceeded smoothly. They began to shout that it seemed that these magicians were their allies, who would not interfere with them. Someone shouted that mages who have such a high level and behind them are a little encouraging for their hopes of winning. The mercenaries shouted and fought. They tried not to miss a single blow from the monsters. The mercenaries ran to the field with even greater confidence and fought. One of them began to shout so that the others would not dare to relax, because they would either win now or never win and lose, and added that he would personally send the deserters to eternal rest. Sylvia bent slightly to the side and repositioned her staff. She screamed, "Fireball!" Miller abruptly approached Sylvia, who connected his hand with her staff, thereby adding power to the staff, while the girl was shocked by his unexpected action. He said that he would help her, and he also screamed, "A ball of fire." Their eyes glanced at each other. Sylvia looked at him, and he looked at her. They connected their magic between each other and began to prepare a stronger attack. Sylvia screamed in concentration. Their huge fireball flew straight towards the battlefield at high speed. The games only had time to look at them. Their faces began to melt under such a strong pressure of fire. There was a gigantic explosion. The mercenaries jumped to the side while others who were at a greater distance looked at the source of the sound, and one of the monsters decided to attack one such mercenary. This mercenary sharply pierced the dead man with a blow of his sword. Another mercenary hit the monster with his axe. He noted that in battle you always need to be as collected as possible, and noted that otherwise this battle could be the last. The younger mercenary was not far from this. He asked the adult not to grumble anymore, and noted that the vice captain should look in that direction, and pointed his hand to this place. The sun has begun to rise and is bathing the skies in brighter hues. The mercenary guy noted that sunrise was coming and the sun was rising. The vice captain of the mercenaries shouted that the monsters were running away, and added that the mercenaries should not chase after them, but should stay in line. Sylvia and Miller stood straight on the counter and looked at the sun. Theodore was very tired, sweat was running down his face, and his eyes were downcast. He noted that so far they were lucky and were able to avoid the worst outcome of the battle, which would have greatly affected them. Theodore and a drunkess fell exhausted and sat on the roof of the caravan, Miller pulling his tie away from him and breathing heavily while the girl leaned on her staff. Theodore looked at the sky, and he was very surprised and began to look closely at the sky. A huge bird was flying towards them, but it was not a bird, but some kind of monster, a wyvern. The wyvern was getting closer and closer to them, while Theodore shouted that it was impossible, that the evening had returned to them. Theodore formed his hands into the shape of a pistol and took aim. He was tense and weakened. Miller noted in his thoughts that he needed to intercept the wyvern with magic bullets, and added, stopping himself, that it was really too late. Sylvia and Miller stood up and raised their hands while the wyvern was still approaching them. They screamed, "The triple layer protection bracelet." Streams of sweat were running down Miller's face. He was very tense. He noted in his thoughts that his instincts were telling him that their shield would not be able to hold out much longer. Randolph looked at it all. He noted that this was happening here. He seemed to ask himself. He turned towards Sylvia and Theodore as the wyvern almost caught up with him with a blaring cry. The man asked himself whether these were really magicians, and noted that they were just children. The wyvern flew very close to Randolph and attacked him with its mouth open. It screamed heart-rendingly while the man placed a block in front of him. Randolph frowned at the wyvern. With a sharp movement of his hand, he cut the wyvern completely with his sword in a split second. Sylvia and the main character continued to hold the shield while the remains of the wyvern flew at them. The main character was surprised. He shouted what it was. Randolph grinned and stood right in front of the magicians. While they looked at him, they were very tired. The man noted that he was finally able to get rid of this splinter. He was proud of himself. He smiled and looked at Sylvia and Miller. Randolph noted that he still hadn't descended when he arrived here, so he couldn't catch her for long, and he added that he didn't know where these magicians came from, but he thanked them. Miller showed him the class with his hand while Sylvia looked at him incredulously. Miller noted that this is not so, and on the contrary, they are very grateful to him. Theodore put his hand to his heart and looked at the man while Sylvia hid behind him. He noted that he was Theodore, an investigator who had been sent by the Magical Society, and said that his colleague, Sylvia, was standing next to him. Sylvia greeted and looked away. Randolph put his daggers back and secured them with straps. He noted that the magicians introduced themselves first, and so formally at that, and added that he should then behave appropriately. He looked slyly at the magicians. Randolph noted that they were mercenaries who were hired by the head of the village, and added, introducing himself, that they were wandering wolves. He turned to face them and smiled. Randolph said that he was the head of these mercenaries, scum, and his name was Randolph. Randolph looked at Sylvia and Miller sternly. He noted that he apologizes for this and said that the situation is not safe now. Miller looked at him awkwardly, and he continued that he needed proof of their identities. Theodore's mouth dropped open and his brow furrowed because he couldn't believe that he was going home for the first time in 5 years and going through an identity check. A green-eyed man with red hair and brown clothes politely said that he also did not want to cause a commotion, but the situation was not the best. Randolph put his hands on his waist, grinned and suggested that the main character carry out a simple verification and then go their separate ways. Theodore closed his eyes exhaustedly, agreed and said that he understood everything, reaching for something under the fabric of his long robe. When Theodore handed the man a folded scroll, he immediately recognized the investigator's certificate, although he had not seen one for a long time, and concluded that the certificate was genuine because it bore the royal seal. Randolph unrolled the scroll and carefully read what was written on the certificate, saying that the protagonist's surname sounded like the surname of some local lord. Theodore coughed, bringing his fist to his lips, and with a smile and a raised eyebrow, he confirmed that the local lord was his father. Suddenly Randolph began to sweat and put on a stupid wide smile, saying that he had made a big mistake because he realized that the main character was the son of his employer. The man with a friendly smile offered his hand to Theodore and politely greeted the young master, saying that there had been a little fuss, but it was not that important at the moment. The main character shook Randolph's palm and said that he has a big gang.